Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your year ahead horoscope forecast for Taurus and Taurus rising for the entire year ahead of 2023. All right, so I'm doing this as a live stream today in order to get these horoscopes out relatively quickly. So if you have any questions or if you have any comments about how you've experienced some of these transits, let me know in the live chat and I'll see if I can respond to some of those questions later towards the end. All right, so let's jump right into it, Taurus. So here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. And these are some of the transits that I want to focus on today and some of the major planetary alignments in 2023, along with some of the dates that we're going to talk about here, just in order to get through the key turning points during the course of the next 12 months. So the first one that I want to focus on is right at the beginning of the year, Mars is finishing up its retrograde period, which is going through the sign of Gemini, which is your second house of money and finances and resources. So this is a transit that began way back in August when Mars first moved into or first ingressed into your second house of finances, but it really intensified around late October when Mars slowed down and stationed retrograde in your second house of finances. And that's been somewhat intense because we're only recently getting about halfway through that transit. So Mars transits tend to indicate sometimes, in the best case scenario, periods in which we put a lot more emphasis and effort and focus on that area of life. In your case, that would be on making money and doing what it takes in order to bring in an income. So some of the positive sides of this can just be increasing your money-making potential by just putting a lot more effort into finances than at other times, or in some instances doing what it takes in order to clean up your finances, even if it involves cutting some things out or getting rid of some bills and other things that maybe are no longer useful. So the downside of this transit is that Mars transits through the second house can sometimes indicate conflicts or tensions surrounding money and resources in your life, and especially around the time of the stations, with the very first station taking place or the second station taking place around January 12th. This may be a time period in which you may have to confront some things head on in your life that are causing challenges for you financially and maybe even leading to some financial losses. So sometimes people get in a period of spending more impulsively or being somewhat reckless with their finances during this time, and that's definitely a potential. So if you're already have that sort of tendency, or if you already had Mars connected with the financial sector in your chart, that can be a greater tendency. So you may want to be careful during this time just not to spend it impulsively, not to do anything reckless that could lead to major financial losses. And additionally, if there's a potential for conflict over finances involving you or other people, to try to steer clear of that, or at least go into it knowing that this could be a period that could be a little bit more tricky for finances than other times. So that period is going to last, of that Mars transit, is going to last all the way through March 25th, because that's the point at which Mars will eventually leave that sign of Gemini and move into your third house of communication and short distance travel. So pay attention to that as one of the initial sort of opening transits during the course of this year. If anybody's already been experiencing some financial issues related to that, let me know in the live chat. I'd like to check that out. All right, so next transit that I want to talk about for Taurus rising is Saturn is going to move into the sign of Pisces on March 7th, and this is going to begin a 3-year-long transit of Saturn through this sign. So on the one hand, this is kind of a good thing because Saturn is departing from a 3-year transit through your 10th house of career and reputation and your overall life direction. So Saturn 10th house transits can be periods of consolidation where sometimes you can have setbacks when it comes to your career, or you can have obstacles that come up that you have to overcome in order to go where you want. Or in some instances, Saturn transits for a number of you have completely told you no, that you can't proceed further in a certain direction with your career. So the good news is that 3-year long transit is over, and I think there's going to be a bit of a lightening up once Saturn departs from your 10th house here in March. So after that, Saturn's going to move into Pisces and begin a 3-year long transit through your 11th house of friends and groups and social movements. So this may be a period of consolidation when it comes to friends and groups at this point in your life. And what happens with that, let's see, what happens when you have Saturn transit in your 11th house is sometimes you can go through a period where friendships are a little bit more difficult to come by, or where you can sometimes encounter a sort of falling out with friends, or sometimes have to make some decisions about what friendships you keep in your life. Maybe in some instances you've kind of outgrown some friendships, or there's some friends that aren't being very good to you, or that you may need to have a sort of reappraisal about what you're getting from the friendship and if it's actually enough to keep putting energy into it. In some instances, the answer will be yes, and you'll just go through a period of really figuring out who your closest friends are and solidifying some of those bonds. But in other instances, you may find that you don't want to continue to keep certain friendships, and they might fall out of your life, either naturally or in some instances more actively or more deliberately. So as soon as Saturn goes into your 11th house in March, you should start getting a preview of what that's going to be like, and that's going to be a transit that's going to happen sort of off and on in greater levels of intensity over the course of the next 3 years through early 2026. So that's a pretty big transit coming up, and a pretty big shift. All right, so one of the other pretty big shifts is that Pluto is going to dip into Aquarius, and it's going to dip into your 10th house here for a few months between March 23rd and June 11th. So this is going to go into the career sector of your chart again, just like Saturn has been over the past few years. But whereas Saturn tends to constrict things or indicate periods of consolidation or slowing down, Pluto has a tendency to take little things and sort of blow them up and make them much bigger. So for you, having Pluto going through your 10th house of career may indicate a period in which you either go through a major transformation in terms of your career, or you find yourself in positions of power career-wise that are much bigger than you ever dealt with before. And you start having issues and questions about how you wield power when you're in a position of authority. Sometimes it can be the reverse, where it's that you're in a subordinate position and you're having to deal with superiors that are wielding power in ways that can be somewhat difficult or controlling or manipulative, and you have to find a way to balance that out in your life one way or another. So either scenario is possible. This is a pretty long-term transit because this is just Pluto dipping in for a few-month preview of what is otherwise going to be a 20-year long transit through this sign of Aquarius. So I don't want to emphasize that too much because it's going to last for such a long chunk of your life coming up here for the next couple of decades, but it will be interesting to pay attention to just that first few month dip of Pluto into Aquarius just to get a little bit of a preview of what's coming up over the course of the next couple of decades, just in terms of your career. All right, moving on. Some of the other transits happening this year is we've got a lot of Jupiter action taking place where in the first 5 months of the year, it's going to zoom through Aries and zoom through your 12th house. But then eventually, Jupiter in the middle of May is going to move into the sign of Taurus and into your rising sign. Or if for some people this may be your sun sign or your moon sign. My horoscopes, I usually recommend looking at them from the perspective of your rising sign, although sometimes you can look from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you're born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if you're born at night. So the 12th house transit is going to be tied in with some eclipses that are also going to be taking place this year in your 10th house, where we're going to get a shift of the eclipse axis from your 1st and 7th house, which is Taurus and Scorpio. And that is your like self versus relationships axis. And we're going to get a shift of the eclipses to the the health and work axis, basically the 6th and 12th house axis for the most part. So I think some of that's going to be very positive. So eclipses plus Jupiter traveling through your 12th house in the first half of the year is usually indicative of a period of expansion and growth by looking within and going through a period of reflection, looking back on the past. Sometimes this can bring up issues from the past, but in a way that's healing or in a way that helps you to address and deal with things that happened from the past. It can be a good time to explore looking into mental health things and ways to improve your mental health, either through therapy or other practices that can help you to address different things that you have going on mentally. And this is going to be tied in also because we're going to be getting some eclipses in the 6th house with a period of needing to focus a little bit more on your physical health at the same time. So some people actively start new major health regimes during this time or regimens during this time, like starting to go to the gym, starting to eat healthier or do other things. The big theme with eclipses is, my keywords for them is major beginnings and major endings. So here is the date of the eclipses. We've got one in Aries in your 12th house on April 20th. Then we've got one in your 7th house of relationships on May 5th in Scorpio. There's another eclipse later in the year, the second eclipse series, starting on October 14th, is in Libra in your 6th house of health and work. And then finally, we've got a Taurus eclipse in your 1st house of self, body, and mind on October 28th. So there's a lot of health focus this year, and a lot of additional emphasis on health and bodily matters, as well as potentially mental health. But as I said, since eclipses can represent major beginnings and major endings, it may just be closing one chapter of your life when it comes to some health matters and the way that you've been dealing with either physical or mental health for a number of years, and opening up a new chapter where you're sort of treating those topics in a different way that takes your life forward in a more positive direction, especially with Jupiter transiting through your 12th and 1st houses this year. So that looks like it could be actually very positive. All right. One of the other things that's coming up this year is we've got a Venus retrograde that's coming up in the sign of Leo, which is, and it's happening this summer in your 4th house of home, family, private life, and sometimes the parents or the living situation are all 4th house topics. So a Venus retrograde in the 4th house, in one sense, I've seen different people reorganizing or redecorating their house, like basically finding a way in order to make their living situation more comfortable or more aesthetically pleasing is a pretty common trend. But it can indicate just a positive period in terms of your home and living situation, so that, for example, if things have been up in the air recently, or if you've had any problems in terms of your living situation, having a Venus retrograde there, especially if you have a night chart, can be a period where you go back and you're able to rectify some issues in that area of your life and basically clean up a bit, in either metaphorically or sometimes very, very literally. In other instances, Venus retrogrades can sometimes have you bring back old relationships or go back and look at old relationships in your life and reassess them. So for Taurus rising, since this is taking place in your 4th house of home and family, it may be that there are some of you who need to go back and reassess some relationships with your parents and some of the things that have happened with them in the past. So in some instances, this can be a little bit challenging or a little bit difficult, but usually by the end of the transit, there's some sort of positive rectification or sometimes reconciliation. So if there's a family member that you've had a falling out with that you'd like to reconnect with, this could be a good time for that. So the dates for that transit are, it's going to first ingress into Leo on June 5th, then it's going to station retrograde on July 20th, and that's the intensification of the transit. Then Venus will station direct on September 3rd, which is the second period of intensification. And then finally, the transit will wrap up after that, and Venus will depart from Leo on October 8th. So the most intense period is definitely going to be when it's actually retrograde between July 22nd and September 3rd. But really, the entire transit is just one elongated transit of Venus going through the sign of Leo in your fourth house. And to the extent that it's just one long fourth house transit, it really starts on June 5th and it doesn't end until Venus leaves that sign on October 8th. All right, so that could be pretty positive transit. Moving on, the last thing I want to focus on, I've already touched on this a little bit, but I want to, again, because the eclipses are the last thing that takes place at the beginning of the year, we have that first set early in the year, and we have a second set of eclipses that's taking place in October. So one of the things about this is over the past year, you've already been having eclipses taking place in your first and seventh houses. And that's lasted for pretty much the entirety of 2022. But there's going to be a continuation of that story or that narrative into 2023. And what usually happens when people have eclipses taking place in their first and seventh houses is they have major beginnings or major endings when it comes to their sense of self and their sense of relationships and the role that close personal one-on-one relationships play in their life. So sometimes this can indicate the beginning of new major relationships in a person's life, or in other instances, it can indicate the ending of major relationships in a person's life, which sort of like opens you up for a new beginning or a new chapter of your life. What I usually see is that people, when eclipses are happening in the first and seventh, kind of teeter-totter back and forth between putting more emphasis on relationships or more emphasis on themselves and what they need to do that makes them happy and just helps to accentuate what they want out of life. And what happens is usually people keep jumping back and forth in 6 month increments, sometimes putting more emphasis on relationships to the detriment of their self, and other times putting more emphasis on themselves to the detriment of their relationships. So this, for some of you, is a theme that's already been happening in 2022, but we're going to see the continuation and eventually the completion of this theme and this sequence of events, so that hopefully by the end of it, by the end of 2023, you will have found some balance between self versus others in your life, and you can kind of move on, having made a new major beginning in that area, but also having moved forward or sort of progressed to some extent in terms of your overall life story or narrative, and in terms of finding balance between yourself and others in your life. All right, so I think that's actually the last major transit I wanted to touch on. So there's, of course, a number of other things. There's like Mercury retrogrades that are going to happen this year. There's other little minor transits. We've also got some mundane transits. A lot of that is stuff we're going to talk about next week on December 16th when we record our big annual year ahead forecast for 2023, where we look at sort of the big picture mundane astrology. But I think in terms of just covering some of the basic stuff of transits for you this year, that's kind of all that I wanted to cover for this year ahead horoscope. So let me know in the comments how some of those past transits have hit your chart and how you've experienced them so far in 2022, as well as what you might anticipate some of these other transits that I've mentioned, how that might be lining up for you, if you can kind of see how the outlines of that are already starting to fall into place at this point, which many of you they may already be. All right, so I think that's it for this horoscope. I'm going to play the end credits and then answer some questions in the live chat for the next 5 minutes. But otherwise, thanks for joining me for this horoscope. Good luck in 2023, and I'll see you again next year. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code AstrologyPodcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. I also recently published a new translation of the anthology of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, which is one of the most important sources for understanding the practice of ancient astrology. You can find that by searching for Vedius Valens, the anthology, on Amazon or other online book retailers. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology, where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. I also recently launched a new course there called the Birth Time Rectification course, where I teach students how to figure out your birth time using astrology when the birth time is either unknown or uncertain. You can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Each year, the podcast releases a set of astrology calendar posters for the coming year, and we've just released our 2023 planetary alignments and planetary movements posters, which are now available on our website at theastrologypodcast.com/store. There you can also pick up our 2023 electional astrology report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through the next 12 months, and we picked out the single most auspicious date for each month using the principles of electional astrology. You can get that at theastrologypodcast.com/2023 report. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.